Hi, thanks for joining me, the omnivorous reader, here on what is, on the east coast of Australia, a cold and brisk August afternoon as I review the books I have most lately finished, which is Flare by Roger Zelazny and Thomas T. Thomas. So this is a not inconsiderable commitment, but I picked it up. I just felt it was time. I had to read it. Roger Zelazny, of course, is a long-term favourite of mine. I adore Roger Zelazny. I would probably read his shopping list if they published that. I will read and buy anything on the strength of his name being on the cover of this rather battered little book. To be honest, it was pretty battered when I bought it, and it's gotten more so as I carried it around in my bag. It's a Bayan book, and I forgot to look up who did the cover. Probably wouldn't get too excited about the cover. The co-author is Thomas T. Thomas, of whom I'd never heard. However, while I was looking online for him, he's actually written quite a few books. He's a contemporary author. He's on Goodreads. Some of his books look very nice indeed, and I might well indulge sometime when I come across them. However, I bought Flare mostly for Roger Zelazny. Now, Roger Zelazny is a classic SF author. He did write science fiction, but I feel like he's primarily remembered for his fantasy or speculative fiction rather than his hard science fiction. So it's probably Thomas T. Thomas's influence that makes this a thoroughly hard science fiction book. It starts off in the sun, and surprising no one with a name like Flare. At least the first reading part appears to be about the sun, and as this book evolves, one learns that yes, it is about the sun, but not in your traditional fashion. So the initial chapters were both fascinating, surprising, and a significant investment. I felt this started with the hardest hitting science from any science fiction I'd encountered recently. It describes the astrophysics and the solar physics of how the sun works at a molecular level, down from the plasma to the heat to the various convection currents that carry around. And what all this was aiming for is for how solar flares and sunspots develop. But from the early chapters, you've got a lot of electrons and protons and electrons going here and molecules combining. And my physical chemistry is rudimentary at best and a long time in the past. It was fascinating, but it needed dedicated reading. For anyone who has never really bonded with Roger Zelazny over the fact that his science is more speculative, this is the hard science Roger Zelazny that you've been waiting for, whether you knew it or not. So at the center of these early chapters, the descriptive power is working around the environment of the plasmotes, because this book is hypothesizing a type of intelligence arising in the actual sun's plasma, corona, surface. As you can tell, I read it with great attention, but my solar astronomy is still not that great. Very interesting though. These small entities, these plasmodes, are each distinct, and they aren't biologically evolved in the same way that life on Earth is. They've got a different type of intelligence, and they emerge through a whole heap of completely disconnected stories. Now, having started with them, we realized that the whole book is basically this, a whole heap of small segments of disconnected yet combining stories. It is very information dense from the beginning to the end, but the snippets are often disconnected. So one gets the sense that each one of these minor stories is building towards something. You just have to read along to find it. So the very first story, it's a book in 6 parts, by the way. In the first part, we start in the sun, but also way back in our past, 1 million BCE, and for a while we're on a linear timeline approaching our own current reality. We're talking about the sun and how it affects different aspects of society and evolution. They're all connected with random phrases that don't seem to really mean everything. At the beginning of each chapter or segment, you've got these stepped words: ping, 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 ping. Okie doke, ping, 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 ping. Sure. Later on, it's tick, 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 click. And sometimes they have a relevant bearing on the story you're about to read, and other times I couldn't quite see the point of them. Now, from the recurring characters of the plasmotes, we move on to Dr. Freed, and we find that the current time is 2081, where mankind is spreading throughout the solar system. We haven't left the solar system yet, but there's a lot of people living in orbit on Mars, on the moon, and various other places. Dr. Freed is a breakaway physicist. He believes that solar cosmology is still worth studying, though he is one of the last of the academics who is interested in this, because we learned that sunspots and solar activity has not been, or it's been 75 to 80 years since any has been observed, and most scientists and physicists, etc., believe that the sun is no longer worth studying due to a lack of activity. Dr. Freed disagrees. Using his own funding, he's built a solar research vessel called Hyperion, and we learn that he's circling an orbit out of Mercury much closer to the sun in order to gather data that he couldn't get on Earth. Now, later on, we skip from Dr. Freed to 2 or 3 different perspectives of his academic postgrads, and one who's about to do his postgrad but hasn't got there yet, all of whom are interested in solar study, and we find how very marginalized and how very uninterested the academic world is in this aspect of science. So I feel like one of the authors, and I'm going to guess Thomas since I've never noticed it in Zelazny before, had been seriously burnt by academic structures, and I agree with him. I saw some pretty unpleasant academic behaviors from scientists when I was associated with universities more closely in the academic sphere. There's some bitterness that comes through when it talks about how Dr. Freed's work has been regarded by his contemporaries, and how his postgrads are being treated now that he's left Earth. Now, the idea that solar research has been sidelined purely because solar flares aren't being observed seems unlikely, but I bore with it bravely. Okay, so, and you've got all these small snippets of someone who's living on the moon, someone who's living on an outer moon of Jupiter, it might have been, a whole heap of different snippets that show you how this future world is using technology. And in parts 2, you particularly get into 1 or 2, I think, you also get into the fact that since solar flares and solar radiation are no longer a problem, as humanity spreads through the solar system, there is very little shielding being applied to any of the communications devices, any of the platforms, and so on. And so we get our sense of impending doom, which is great. The impending doom in this book is wonderful. We see what happened. So around about part 2, I think it is, we get to the phase of the plot when we're about 100 pages in. The lead-in was good, and while it was a slow build, I thoroughly enjoyed the slow build. It's got that nice touch of Zelazny's deft, beautiful writing, which can at times be very, very literary and very, very gorgeous, and other times it's just lovely. Okay, that outer moon was Phoebus. Anyone who's read Ian M. Banks can correct me on that one if I'm misreading that. And it starts with one person who seems to be a bit of a mad mad person living on his own on it, and he calls himself Kiefer the First, Grand Duke of Syrtis Major and hereditary Lord of Phoebus, stood before the door of his royal citadel and gritted his teeth. The pressure brought the strangest sounds to his ears, the beating of his own heart, the click and moan of his air regulator, the creak of his boots in the stony soil. That's just pure Zelazny descriptive power to me. And I loved it. So I enjoyed the slow build in this rather major book of 344 pages. Now, around about part 2 is when we start to get into the sunspot evolving. We learn from Dr. Freed in his orbit around Mars. First he sees it, then he realizes he's copped an immense dose of radiation. He tries to contact the Earth through communication devices to warn him, but of the ion storm that followed the spot and the radiation are blocking him. So the next person we see is a person who works on the Lunar Luxury Resort, who gets hit while taking a group of tourists on a moonwalk, which is when all their communications break down. They're isolated out there, and there's this wonderful tinge of the horror of being isolated on a lunar landscape when you've got no communication device. And another spot on Earth, once the radiation hits, it scrambles all of the communications, basically. Anyone who doesn't have a specific type of phone, which I'm going to say is probably copper line. They call it something else, but I think it's something like that. Most of the communications are like ours, they're atmospheric based, and they get completely scrambled. In this future world, most people rely on virtual reality for their day-to-day activities. So one of the postgrads is teaching undergrads, and he does it in a virtual reality room, which is constructed so that you can actually see the solar system drifting around you while he talks. And there's a virtual reality game, virtual reality trademarked, I think it's called, where there's a young man, I think he's in 16 or 17, who's playing a virtual reality game of Pompeii. He's been inserted into Pompeii as a wealthy landowner, and the volcano is about to erupt, and his game is to escape unscathed. And we find him inserted into this virtual reality at the time when everything goes catastrophic, and it basically seems to fry his brain in strange ways. Another person is a respectable trader on the stock exchange in, I'm going to say probably Hong Kong. I believe it was Hong Kong. All the electrodes are fried, and his brain goes with it because all the people jacked in at the time are fried too. Essentially, anyone around the world who is jacked into the virtual realities upon which all the entertainment, education, and many of the businesses rely fry instantly. And we have a couple of scenes later in the book with the hospitals trying to deal with that. One of my favorite little segments was in the cockpit of an aeroplane of the future. I can't remember what they called it. I think they called it a semi-ballistic, not sure. The pilots basically sit in a fully virtual reality pod, relying on the craft gathering the information they need to land it. And then suddenly there's no electronic feedback and no information. They can't see anything in the pod, but if they close down the pod, all their controls are actually virtual. So the co-pilot stays inside the pod manipulating the controls based on what the primary pilot outside sees looking out the window. Or was it the other way around? They tried both ways. That segment was utter genius. That is probably not the segment you want to read if you're scared of flying in 2025, but I thought it was marvellous. There's another segment much later in the book where a maglev that relies on magnetic gravity to propel these trains around probably the USA at speeds of over 200 kilometers per hour. All of a sudden, the electronics don't work. And the operator, who's never been required to actually operate anything in his life, has to make some tough decisions. There's a whole heap of marvellous small stories. Now, around about now was when I checked the publication date, which I hadn't previously done, which is why I'm not calling it classic SF. This was published in 1992, which I believe is more modernish rather than classic science fiction. And that was the point at which I was starting to notice an interesting thing. I'm sure I'm not the only person on here who remembers the panic leading up to year 2000 when the year 2K bug was meant to totally wipe out all the computers in the world. You wouldn't be able to transition from the digits 1999 to 2000. All the banking was going to collapse. Society, as we know it, was going to go smash, and all the doomsday preppers were in seventh heaven, and not much happened. I'm not unhappy about that. Flair seems to be a little bit coming from the mentality that spawned the year 2K terror. You've not got the end of society as we know it, but we've got all these major things that happen to totally inconvenience aspects of society. So yes, okay, so we've got this novel in 6 parts. The early part being a slow lead up about the physical chemistry of the sun and the way it affects the colonized solar system. The science is slow reading. Not only do you have the slow astronomy at the beginning of the sun, but every time the authors give you a new aspect of society, they tell you the science upon which it's based. So I've got one person who's building these sun skimmers that basically have these huge wings that propel them through the solar winds between planets. Every time they come up with a new one, they explore it in detail and with a lot of scientific detail. And it seems to me that what the authors did in this book was basically imagine all the things that fascinated them about how science could go in the future, collect the ones that could be strongly affected by a solar flare, radiation, or an ion storm, and explore and take you with them on a journey of what could happen. It's great fun for the person who likes their science fiction. You have a few characters and a few scenarios that continue throughout the book, but generally speaking, you skip from one to the other. And you have a few characters that appear only once to illustrate a particular segment. For example, as the flares come through, the authors give this gorgeous description of what is basically like the Northern Lights, only it's all the way through the world as this ion storm engulfs the whole thing. And how one lonely old woman in her 80s thinks she's seeing angels and the lights in the sky and all the other things. Anyway, it is quite stunning. Now, each of the 6 parts start off with verses written by a pharaoh, which was an interesting thing. I'm seeing a lot of Roger Zelazny, and that Roger Zelazny loved his mythologies, and I don't remember him ever doing one whole book about Egyptian mythology, so maybe this was his bow to it. There was a pharaoh, Akhenaten, who from the 5th year of his reign, which is around about 1355 before current era, changed his name from Amenhotep and changed his kingdom from what was basically a very polytheistic, multiple gods, multiple religions, to a more monotheistic sun worship. Now, I know I've got some friends out there who are into niche interests in mythology. Hands up, who knew there was a whole body of literature from ancient Egypt? My hand is not up, not before reading this book it wasn't, but apparently there's something called the Great Hymn to the Aten, which is sun, and it's one of the several poetic verses written to the sun deity and composed in the round of the middle of the 14th century before the current era, and they may be attributed to the pharaoh in question, Akhenaten, who made sun worship or tried to make sun worship the primary religion of Egypt at the time. Reading up on him, it sounds like it could also be attributed to other people, but this book is attributing it to him and is starting each segment with a rather beautiful piece of poetry to the sun and its power. So this book was a lot. I really enjoyed it, but yeah, there's a lot there. I loved the reading experience, but I had to concentrate. It wasn't an easy book to pick up and read a couple of pages or sit down. I had to really sit and concentrate for time. It required my full attention and my full concentration, which was actually really enjoyable. It was great immersing myself in a science fiction book instead of just reading flick off the cuff like I have been for a while with science fiction. There is this linear theme throughout the book, like I say, but not following the main character in a more traditional type novel theme might not appeal to everyone, but anyone who loves Roger Zelazny should definitely give Flare a go. And anyone who likes the notion of aliens evolving as sun plasma creatures. The ending of this book is essentially a gentle nod to the evolving intelligence of the plasma. It's these atypical, abiological creatures who have evolved in the sun's plasma, and it goes forward in time from the point at which most of this book occurs to a point where they have evolved to the point where they can build their own spaceships and roam the galaxy in search of other suns. By any measure, this is an unusual science fiction. It's unusual. It would be very unusual for classic science fiction, and as a 90s science fiction, it's right on that verge of where other things started happening in SF. I enjoyed a lot. I thoroughly do recommend Flare by Roger Zelazny and Thomas T. Thomas. I will try to look for more Thomas T. Thomas in the future because pretty good book. Thank you for watching. Read good books.